Hi, this is the fourth and final week of the course, How Christianity Changed the World. And today we're going to talk about sexual morality, and then we're going to end it up with the status of women in the ancient world. Most of our 21st century movies about ancient cultures, they put our present morality back into history. And they do that because a lot of people think, well, human beings haven't really changed that much. But of all the movies or the textbooks that you've seen or read, what can you deduce about ancient morality? Well, it's kind of interesting. Roman writers, people like Juvenal, Catullus, Martial, and Ovid, testify that sexual activity between men and women had become depraved before and during the time that the Christians appeared in Roman society. Adultery, fornication, homosexuality, sadism, orgies, bestiality, that sort of thing, had become common and were even illustrated on household items like oil lamps, bowls, cups, and vases. Yeah, even children saw these items, so modesty was really nowhere to be found. Specifically, adultery was exclusively defined in terms of the woman's status, not the man's. And it was listed as a property violation. Now, ladies, don't kill the messenger. I'm just telling you what it was. I'm not agreeing with it. So a man, married or single, couldn't be accused of adultery, but a woman could because she was another man's wife, and adultery was a property offense, usually punishable by death. As a result of this, many married women registered as temple prostitutes, so they were not exclusively seen as their husband's property, and they could commit adultery without being punished. Now, being a temple prostitute was almost considered a calling. It wasn't considered a bad thing. But into this culture, Christianity came and said that sex between a husband and a wife was an expression of mutual love and respect, and not of self-serving, lustful gratification. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, it says this. This is Paul talking. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Christians also believed that sex made them one flesh, and it required them to be faithful. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 rather, it says this, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." Contrary to the Greco-Roman worldview at the time, they saw sex outside of marriage as wrong and sinful. According to a 2nd century document, in the Roman world, it said this, they, speaking of the Christians, they have a common table, but not a common bed. So believers saw marriage as a type of relationship that was exclusive. It was one man and one woman for a lifetime. They also saw it as a type of a shadow of a relationship between believers and God. And that's in Ephesians chapter 5. Another type of sex is homosexuality. That was mostly practiced in ancient times, what we would call pedophilic sex or pederastic sex between an adult man and a young boy. The Greco-Roman gods didn't set high standards, nor did they ask for repentance or forgiveness. That was seen as a weakness. Now, Christianity condemned all forms of extramarital sex, including homosexuality. And I know this is a big topic right now. We don't have the time to get into it right now, but I want to touch on a few things. In Romans chapter 1, verse 27, Paul says this. Well, in verse 26 it says, "Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error." So homosexuality, Christians have always seen as wrong and sinful and contrary to the way God made humans. Today, the outlawing of pedophilia is completely due to Christianity's influence. But the Bible really never differentiates between pedophilia and homosexuality. All are sinful in God's eyes, and it seems whenever pagan values reign, that homosexuality eventually becomes practiced. It was even practiced among the American Indians in some tribes. Obviously, Christians were not admired for rejecting the Roman sexual immoralities. In fact, St. Augustine said in the 5th century that the Romans despised the Christians because they opposed their unrestrained sexual lifestyles. Tertullian, an early church father, said that the Romans so despised the Christians that they even hated the name Christian. It's interesting that no other world religion elevated sexual morality to this degree or anything close to it. Now, we also have a handout sheet on the morality of sex and marriage, where it talks about things like adultery, fornication, prostitution, homosexuality, things like that, bestiality. You can take a look at that handout. The last area I want to talk about is the status of women. Were ancient women accorded the same rights as men? Is Christianity anti-women as certain people say it is today? Well, let's take a look. And again, you're probably not going to find this in your history books. Greek women, believe it or not, were not allowed to leave their house without their husband or without his duly appointed escort, which was usually a male slave. Now, also, when the husband had friends over in his home, his wife wasn't allowed to be with him. She had to retire to her own part of the house. The husband's mistress was allowed to be there, and actually his mistress accompanied him to events outside the home. So his mistress was his companion and his sexual partner in addition to his wife, but she didn't have any of the freedoms that his mistress had. She basically had to tend the home and raise the kids. Also, Greek women could not divorce their husbands, whereas the husbands could divorce them at any time. Greek girls didn't go to school at all, and throughout her life she was not allowed to speak in public. In fact, Greek poets were fond of equating women with evil. You remember the Greek myth of Pandora's box? That blamed women for introducing evil into the world. Wow. Greek female infanticide, the killing of newborn females, far exceeded the killing of newborn males. In fact, one Greek scholar wrote that a male offspring was a Greek mother's principal source of prestige and validation, whereas a female child was an economic and a social burden. You're not going to read that in your history books. Roman women, although they enjoyed a little more freedom than the Greek women, they still had none of the rights and privileges that the men enjoyed. Many women received some education in grammar and reading, things like that, but they still weren't allowed to be present when their husband had guests over for meals. She was under the absolute legal control of her husband, and that was known as the Roman law of manus. And that basically said he had ownership over her and all of her possessions. Again, she couldn't divorce him, although he could divorce her at any time. She even lacked the right to tell her husband's slaves what to do. She was legally prohibited from owning property. The husband could even kill his wife for a non-adulterous offense as long as he had the approval of an extended family tribunal. But in the case of adultery, he could just kill her, and it was legal. She was also prohibited from speaking in public or in court. That just seems incredible to us today, but that was the role of women in the ancient world. The low regard for women also showed itself in how they were treated sexually. Chastity, in the Christian sense, was almost unknown in heathen societies. Women really were slaves to men's lower passions. In John chapter 4, that's where Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman at the well. Now, Samaritans were considered below Jewish men and women, but so it was not cool for Jesus to speak to a Samaritan, but to speak to a woman in public was bad enough, but a Samaritan woman was incredible. In John chapter 11, when Jesus is talking with Martha and Mary, and he's in essence teaching them, that was just considered not done. Oh heavens, call out the PC police. So many things that Jesus did included women that were considered just, well, it wasn't done. Women followed Jesus. Jesus healed women. The Apostolic Church welcomed women. Women were the first to see the resurrected Christ. In fact, that's one thing kind of against the gospel accounts. If you were going to talk about Jesus being resurrected, you definitely did not want to mention as the first people to see him that were women, and yet they did. Christianity's growth was also the direct result of women who did not practice abortion and infanticide and child abandonment, which was so common among the Greeks and the Romans. In fact, given the Roman culture's negativity towards women, they saw the Christian view of women as a threat to their domestic tranquility. And they saw it as a weakness. In 374 AD, when the Roman Emperor Valentinian repealed the 1,000-year-old laws against that sort of thing, part of those laws were against women, and again, he did so because of the Christian influence of a certain bishop. Well, it was his bishop, and that bishop did it based on Galatians chapter 3 verse 28, which says men and women are basically equal before God. So the pagan husband lost the power of death over his family, both his wife and his children, and women were granted essentially the same basic rights as men in property. They were also granted custody of their children, who were previously the sole possession of their husbands. Christian women also married later than their pagan counterparts, but they also married men of their own choice, which before was almost unheard of. Their fathers made that decision for them, so it was mostly arranged marriages. Christianity gave women the freedom to make their own choice for a mate. That's almost completely due to Christianity. Ancient women, a lot of them were veiled. A lot of only the single women, the prostitutes, and the women in the lower classes were required to wear veils, and where women did wear veils, Christianity put a stop to that. Although Greeks and Romans had their mistresses, they were not allowed to marry more than one woman, but in other ancient societies, such as the Middle East, multiple marriages were encouraged. That's polygamy, one man with several wives. What's really incredible is that polyandry, one woman with several husbands, was non-existent. But Christianity stopped this to a large extent. However, it still exists in some non-Christian nations today, particularly Muslim nations. It's even starting to rear its head in America. We'll talk about that in a minute. But as a result of Jesus and his teachings, women, especially in the West, enjoy more privileges and rights than any other time in history. Now, as a result of the recent gay marriage decision, the definition of marriage may be changing yet again. Some Mormon offshoots out west are starting to protest about the illegality of polygamy, and they are using the same arguments that have been used in the gay marriage debate. We also have a handout here, The Role and Status of Women, and it talks about how Christianity has really been the only major world religion that has championed the equality of women with men. I also have several other handouts, and you can look at those. There is a Christian connection to common words and symbols. There's also a Christian derivation of expressions. We also have one on Christian art and architecture. There is one on the progress of music during the Christian era, which was incredible. And then we also have some Christian literary hallmarks. That's the end of this course. I hope you've seen how vitally important Christianity has become to make this world a better place to live, a more fair place to live. Heaven is going to be the ultimate expression of that. So thank you very much. Goodbye.